I'm on the line right now with Dark Side of the Ring executive producer and writer Evan Husney. The second season of the show premieres tomorrow night at 9 p.m. on Vice TV. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks so much for having me.
So, there's a lot of hype going into this season. You know, you had a very successful first one with some stories we knew. Obviously, the Chris Benoit story is a very controversial one, a sensitive one. How did you guys go about, laying out not only this season this time around, but, using that as the season premiere?
Yeah, well, doing a television series that's kind of exploring, these types of stories from the wrestling world, it's kind of hard to ignore the Chris Benoit story, because it was such a massive story at the time. And back in season 1 days, we definitely kicked it around as something that we would explore, but I'm so glad that we didn't, because I just don't think we were prepared at all to take on something like that, or really have the street cred to take on something like that. So moving into season 2, actually months and months and months before we even knew we were going to have a season 2, we started developing the Chris Benoit story as a separate documentary, perhaps, that we would make somewhere else. And so we had spent like 4 or 5 months researching the story. And in that, we sort of felt like this story was worth a re-examination, because, so many aspects of that story, there's so many things now in 2020 that we understand better than I think than we did back in 2007. Whether that's like domestic violence issues, whether that's, mental health issues, both physical and emotional, or whether it's, CTE, of course, which plays a part into the story. And so that's the original thought behind wanting to, tackle the story. But then along the way, once we started to actually talk to people who were involved with the story, and that all happened because of Chavo Guerrero Jr., once we started talking to everybody, we realized that everyone wants to tell the story. They've had the story on their minds and on their chest for a long time now, and whether they've been told not to talk about it or they didn't have a platform to talk about it, because it's such a complicated story. It's such a complicated thing to have, someone that was your best friend, or that was your brother-in-law, or was your father that actually committed these crimes, and how do you come to terms with that? How do you process that? And so then we felt that just kind of all of us coming together to tell the story, that could help in some way for some sort of catharsis, and hopefully a positive conversation around it.
Now, one thing I saw, you actually commented on Twitter over the weekend about, who you assembled to have included in some of the on-air interviews, and Dave Meltzer was not used just because it was a creative decision. But do you feel like the more people that you could have included maybe would have diluted the story, or do you think it's a stronger narrative coming from the people that are here?
Yeah, I mean, it was always kind of the intention to approach this story, trying to gain access to the inner circle. That was very important to us, because that's really the areas that haven't been explored in this story before, in terms of the way that it's been covered previously. And, also, just another creative decision that we have in putting together Dark Side of the Ring is that we really limit the amount of voices that you hear per episode. You never see in a Dark Side of the Ring episode, dozens and dozens of faces and voices just to get them all in there, because we try and keep it as intimate as possible, and we want it to be mostly from firsthand. We don't like to have to rely sometimes on, outside voices if we can help it. That's the key. That's kind of one of the key creative aspects of the show. So for this, we really wanted to make it feel like you were really being told the story from within, and I think it has that effect, and that's something that we're really proud of.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I also enjoyed about it was, the way I watched it was in 2 parts, but it was very much Chris and Eddie and the in-ring stuff, and then the end of it bridged to the murders and everything after that. So I appreciated that there was a division of that, because especially Chris Jericho in recent years has gotten a lot of flack for his opinions on Benoit. Chris his friend, Chris the murderer. Do you feel like your creative vision was realized, and do you think you accomplished the goal of splitting it up and maybe letting people separate, like giving them a way to separate the two things now more than in the past?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also like, just from also being a fan myself, and growing up as a fan and playing as Chris Benoit on like N64 games, growing up through the 90s, and having that relationship with him as who he was as a performer. And then, of course, as we all did in 2007, it was just such a incomprehensible act, that it was so, and that's just from a fan perspective. But our whole goal with kind of part one into part two was really to show the perspective of, people who knew him, but people who knew him in the moment. Like going from, like, knowing Chris Benoit, all the way up through his 90s career, and then up until when Eddie passes away, and then right up leading up to the event. It's kind of from the perspective that people had in the moment. And then what we wanted to do is then in part two, we wanted to cover the crimes and, cover what happened in there, and then the aftermath, of course, and then looking back and looking into what kind of led us here. And that was kind of the way that we wanted the story to unfold, because, that's kind of what it mirrors a little bit of the experience of the people that are in it, which was like, you didn't see many telltale signs. And then, of course, we look back, and then with hindsight, you do see some telltale signs, or you do see some other, things that you may never know, because no one's here left to tell that side of it, So that's kind of the experience we wanted to create with the episode.
Do you think this one in particular is going to resonate with more fans, since there's a bigger group, there's a bigger majority of people that pretty much lived through this one, opposed to some of the stories in season one or maybe coming up? Like, I can sit here and tell you exactly where I was when I watched that episode of Raw, and then the next day, so it's like very much like I remember it like it's yesterday.
Yeah, I do think it is going to resonate more. Because it was just such a massive event, and it is one of the larger, controversial, tragic moments in wrestling that really transcended that world, and it went far beyond that and opened up other conversations. I mean, Chris Jericho in the episode talked about how it almost killed the industry. So this was a massive story. So I think looking back on it, and because it's become taboo to talk about in certain ways, and it's very complicated and very triggering for a lot of people to mention his name or to show a picture of him or to whatever. It's all very complicated. So it is kind of like, how do we deal with this? Because it is part of the history, and how do we process it and how do we look at it, And I think one of the things that was very eye-opening to us throughout the whole process was just everyone we're talking to who's involved with the story, they are victims in some ways too, because they're still here and they have to deal with trying to understand this and trying to piece it together. And so I think those are the types of people that, sometimes we as fans or outsiders in the story, we forget. And that was something we didn't want to do, because when you put yourself in their shoes, it is pretty overwhelming, to try and come to terms with something like that.
Is that point about seeing the other people involved as victims, is that something maybe that changed your outlook or mindset on this subject, or is there anything you can talk about, from the process of this show, this episode, that changed your perspective on Chris?
I think it did, because I think it changed my perspective. I mean, obviously, the first time I spoke with, say, David Benoit or Sandra Toffoloni, Nancy's sister, obviously you can tell, the effect that this has had on them, but spending time with them as people, and then also interviewing them for hours on end. That really resonated with me as really truthfully, because some of the parts that we get into towards the back end of the second episode, those are some of the heavier, more emotional moments that we've ever filmed, and kind of capturing these two different sides of the family kind of coming together, and that, I think, for us was just one of the more overwhelming, emotional moments that we've ever captured. But so that just so getting to know getting to know everyone involved in this story so intimately now, it just definitely gives you a different perspective on it. It's just hard not to.
Mm-hmm. To kind of preview a few more of the subjects coming up, you have New Jack, the Brawl for All. Owen Hart is coming later in the season. And, he's another name that, even though his death was an accident and it's tragic, he's not spoken about on TV for other reasons. And we've kind of heard from his family, it's a touchy situation with them, but what can you tell us about what's coming up? Are there any stories specifically you do want to tell that haven't been told yet? Like, you have two this season that we really haven't had an inside look at as far as like a wrestling fan and since they've happened.
Well, one of the things we try to do with stories that are more familiar, like the Owen Hart story, is we always try and show a different perspective. And I think that the perspective that fans and non-fans are going to see on that story is going to be totally, you're going to learn a lot. I can just say, in terms of the perspective that's going to be shared from the family, from their point of view, and it's we're still putting the final touches on the Owen episode now, but it's really shaping up to be something truly special. And I think that is definitely going to be something that feels new in terms of the perspective. As far as other episodes, one of the ones that I'm really excited about, I'm definitely proud of the New Jack episode. I think that one explores some areas we've never explored in the show. And I also feel like the Herb Abrams UWF story is going to be an entertaining one for a lot of people, because it's for wrestling fans. It's probably a part of wrestling history that they're not as familiar with. It's a deeper cut story about a wrestling fan with a big dream to start his own wrestling promotion. And as those who are in the know, it failed spectacularly. And Herb also, met his end in one of the more outrageous passings of anyone I've ever heard of, ever. So it is a pretty wild story, and I think that one is going to be one that wrestling fans, hardcore wrestling fans, are not going to want to miss.
There's definitely a lot to look forward to. Is there a story in particular that you don't think you can ever tell, whether it's access to people involved or any other particular variable?
The only story that I don't think I'll ever be able to tell, and the story that I would love to tell, is the Vince McMahon story. I would want to tell the Vince McMahon story and only have Vince McMahon in it. And it would be amazing to see the season 3 teaser trailer just open with Vince sitting in an interview position, or something. But I think that's probably a dream.
Okay.
Only a dream.
Hey, who knows? By this time, when you go to do season 3, he might have some interest, or who knows? But
Who knows?
Let's cross fingers. But in the meantime, season 2 premieres tomorrow night with the Chris Benoit episode, Tuesday, March 24th, on Vice TV. Thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.